No, it's fairly obvious that poetry as such uses a phonological system or a language in which it is written in order to achieve certain acoustic effects. And obviously it's kind of woven out of the phonemes that exist in a particular language and uses the combination of those phonemes following the combination patterns typical of particular languages. And obviously those acoustic effects are inherent in all poetic efforts, but I think that some of them, in a sense, display more mimetic effects than others. In other words, sound effects might indeed be used in order to reveal more or less straightforward mimetic correspondences between sound and sense. And this is exactly what I'm going to be interested in. That is, I'm going to look at the sound makeup of poems in terms of iconicity. And this is this classical notion that goes back to semiotics, iconicity being defined as form miming meaning or form miming form, depending on the context. So this perceptible correspondence between form and meaning involved. Yeah, maybe I should just try and remember to use the PowerPoint presentation now. If we go back to this classical distinction or division introduced by Charles Sanders Peirce, iconicity can be divided into three subtypes. We can speak of images, that is signs where we actually perceive quite straightforwardly or immediately a certain resemblance between the form and its referent, like a photograph or a painting, like a representative painting. We can speak of diagrammatic iconicity, where the likeness is based on the reference or structure. So it's actually the structure of the sign that seems to recreate the structure of its referent. For instance, a map is not like a city, but then it just reconstructs topography of the city. And finally, metaphorical iconicity, according to Peirce, would be that mediated through a third idea. Now, if you look at the writings of linguistic specialists in linguistic poetics, especially those inspired by semiotics and by Roman Jakobson, you see that they actually speak of phonosymbolism or auditory iconicity being this kind of perceptible immediacy between sound and sense. Okay? And they would speak of different types of this iconicity. Again, some of those may be more straightforward or obvious than others. So they would speak of magic iconicity being simply the exploitation of the qualities of particular sounds. And here, an obvious example would be the use of onomatopoeia in poetry, onomatopoeia being like speech sounds reconstructing physical, non-linguistic sounds. But you would also have those correspondences that are much more, I would say, suspicious in the sense that they're not altogether obvious and might be arguable. So for instance, the notion of sound symbolism being, in a sense, this presumed correspondence between sounds and some aspects of meaning of words in which they are used. Okay, some scholars would claim they appear irrespective of what language they appear in. This is a much more suspicious notion and arguable in a sense. So here you would have those notions of phonosthemes, for example, as suggested by Firth. So basically like clusters of sounds going together with particular associations, like gl or fl being associated with particular lexical fields. But you would also have more intuitive, in a sense, parallels or patterns. For instance, some scholars would comment on the qualities of consonants being in a sense, iconic. For instance, the use of resonance in nasals and humming sounds, the use of plosiveness or liquidity, harshness or cacophony. We all know that intuitively. They would consider that to be a manifestation of iconicity. Hardness or softness of consonants, concepts by Leach. Then openness and closeness of vowels is a concept proposed by some scholars. Most of those phenomena can be explained as forms of articulatory iconicity. That was the claim by Andreas Fischer. So basically, he would say that the physical or bodily experience of pronouncing particular sounds would be somehow metaphorically projected on the meaning which we associate with the words that include those sounds in that pronunciation. Okay? Like a bodily experience being translated into a semantic experience. Then you would also have examples of diagrammatic iconicity in poetry. That is being the use of rhyme and rhythm, which is based on the patterning of sounds and on the, in a sense, iconicity of form miming form. for instance, creating similarities between, or associations between particular concepts by simply putting them together and drawing or bringing to the fore the similarity of their sounds, like dusk and dust being brought together, somehow blend in our minds and display certain similarities we wouldn't notice otherwise. And so those notions of imagic and diagrammatic iconicity, as proposed by linguistic poetic specialists and by semioticians, may presumably occur in all poetic forms, but I'm particularly interested in the use in acrostic poems, that is, poems that tend to reconstruct or reconstrue certain styles known from visual arts. And I just wanted to focus on two case studies, but I think I'm just going to focus on the first one, that is E. Cummings Picasso, being inspired by the Cubist period of the artist's creativity or over. The other case studies I had was actually David Gascon's Yves Tanguy, so the reconstruction of surrealism rather than cubism. What I found interesting in those acrostic texts was that they were kind of cumulative phrases, that is, that they in a sense tried to reconstruct this style rather than particular works of art. That they were written by the artist's contemporaries, so people who actually knew the artists, and they both play with sound, thus displaying a certain potential for revealing certain kind of imitative or mimetic quality between sound and the visual representation. So I wanted to treat those as if not really verbal representations of graphic representations, but indeed as verbal auditory representations of visual art, in order to see whether there are some interesting patterns or parallels that I may speak of. Now, E. Cummings Picasso is a very interesting example of a poem that was first published in the volume Tulips and Chimneys in 1923, where actually the poet and painter, as Cummings would call himself, in a sense, recreates or reinterprets the work of visual art of the painter among the poets and the poet among the painters, as some critics would call Picasso. I'm not sure if you know, but actually Cummings was really into visual arts himself. These are some of his designs, like Cubist compositions that he created. The poem was published first in 1923 and later on republished in 1924 in The Dial, which was a magazine which both artists kind of used to present their works. And this is actually the poem that I would like to focus on, and I distributed the handout so you can just have a look at that. I'm not sure if I could ask anyone to read it out, because I would probably need a native speaker to do that rather than trying to do that myself. Jennifer, would it be at all possible for you? So maybe, okay, I'm just going to do that myself. Sorry, I do. Okay, just, I love you. If you could.
Come on, Picasso, you give us things which bulge, grunting lungs pumped full of thick mind. You make us shrill presents always shut in the sumptuous screech of simplicity. Out of the black, unbunged, something gushes vaguely, a squeak of planes, or between squeals of nothing, grabbed with circular shrieking tightness, solid screams whisper. Lumberman of the distinct, Lumberman of the distinct, your brain's axe only chops hugest inherent trees of ego, from whose living and biggest bodies lopped of every prettiness, you hew form truly.
Sorry, it's a mouthful. Yeah, so in a sense, if you look at this poem, I think it kind of combines explicit commentary, art commentary, with implicit kind of recreation of certain visual effects that Picasso usually achieved in his art. And as for explicit commentary, I think that the basic metaphor here is that of the lumberman of the distinct. So basically painting being hewing and cleaving, Picasso being the lumberman of the distinct, hewing form. This seems to be a pretty, I would say, cliched metaphor, kind of think of it, if you look at art criticism that has been used and reused over time extensively. But I think that in 1923 it might not have been all that obvious. What I think is being, in a sense, brought to the fore in this particular section of the poem dedicated to the London of the Distinct is this kind of mechanism that is used in Cubism of, in a sense, dissecting reality into smaller pieces, of breaking it into pieces. What is significant is that it is the brain's actually the brain that reads the acts. Okay, and I think what is being highlighted here is the intellectualism of Cubism, that is this kind of deliberate effort on the Cubist's part to, in a sense, smash this illusion of art being transparent pain and to show the actual act of visual representation. So that would be simply breaking the illusionism into pieces and bringing to the fact that visual representation requires a certain interpretation on the part of the artist. This is at least what the critics would say of Cubism. Another important quality is that of distinctness being mentioned in the text, which probably, in a sense, draws on the significance of line and contour in Cubism. Art critics would point to the fact that in this kind of opposition of colour and contour being two important media in visual communication, for Cubism it would be certainly the line or the contour that is particularly important. You would have two stages of Cubism. So they would speak of line being actually the way in which form is structured in Picasso's painting. I'm mentioning the motive of the line and contour because right now I'd like to move to this implicit recreation of Picasso's style in this poem. I think if we look closely into how the first section of the poem is structured, we'll see that it all is based on the schema of a container and actually the activity of closing and opening the boundaries or contours. And let me just justify what I'm saying by showing to you some passages. Well, first, there's the straightforward commentary that actually Picasso gives the viewers potentially things. He gives them presence, then what his art represents is something and then nothing. So this seems extremely vague if you think of a representation of the visual experience. But then what is being very specific in this imagic construal is the notion of what those things, nothings, and somethings are actually doing. What they're doing is they're involved in certain movements which in a sense are built on the image schema of a container, so the movement inside and movement outside. I'm just going to show that to you on the next slide. So if you look at that, the things and the lungs are pumped full of mind, that being like a contour or a container. The presents are shut in simplicity. Planes are gushing out of the black unbunged. Now, the black is unbunged, and so that being open again. Nothing is grabbed with circular tightness, so you have this image, kind of implicit image of closure or contour being evoked here. Now, if we have a closer look at the way in which this contour is being imaged in this poem, we see that it's very tightly associated with sounds, in a sense. So actually contour is made with sound. If you look at that, the lungs are grunting while being pumped full of mind. The presents are shut in the sumptuous screech, their simplicity. The planes squeak, okay? Actually screams are squeezed in between the squeals of nothing. So it's like a representation of sounds kind of reified. This is interesting, that he uses a lot of nominalizations, which seems to, again, mimic this act of imposing contour, which I find actually really amazing. If you look at the sound effects here, obviously Cummings uses a lot of onomatopoeic effects. So we actually have shrilling and shrieking, screeching, squeaking, screaming, squealing, whispering, which in a sense imitates the physicality of sound. They also coupled with other sound symbolic effects, if we wish to call it like that. So we have a lot of alliterations, and if you look at the structure of this poem, there are those sections which are either voiceless or voiced, either in a sense dedicated to openness, like articulatory openness or constriction. The first one uses a lot of liquids like bulge, lungs, full, which, okay, these are all liquid sounds. Then you have the plosives like b, g, p. You have a mid and open vowels, like dark vowels like bulging, grunting, lungs. So it's all evocative of the experience of openness. It's all predominantly voiced. Then if you look at the second section, we have sudden constriction and front vowels like screech, simplicity, in, and also breathiness coming into the picture, so like voiceless constriction. And then the other scenario recurs. So we've got like the reworking of the phonological material here with the plosives and the liquids and the openness. And here again, breathiness and constriction with shrieking tightness, circular shrieking tightness, solid screams whispering. Okay? It's like a mouthful of those particular impressions. So I think these effects are quite meaningful, and this is also coupled with the rhythmic effects that we have. But what I think stands out from this image is the fact that actually here Cummings seems to be using this auditory iconicity in order to make us, in a sense, project the physical qualities of sounds being evoked onto this imagic kind of visual picture construal that is typical of Picasso's art. And obviously all those onomatopoeic effects are in a sense elusive, or they contribute to this massive synesthetic metaphor of Picasso's art. So basically the quality of his contours is being translated into the physical qualities of sounds being evoked. And the power of expression, which is typical of his painting, is kind of translated into the auditory effects that the readers or the listeners might notice while simply pronouncing this poem or listening to this poem, and the effect that it may have on them. So when I tried translating this poem, I realized that obviously the sound quality that is being present there is extremely important. So I felt that I need to kind of resound this poem for the Poles using a completely different phonological system. And I felt that this might be a nice opportunity to simply experiment. So I basically decided to create 3 different versions instead of 1, because what I found truly amazing is that when I looked at the onomatopoeia I used, I realized that many of those in Polish would indeed require of me specifying what the source of the sound is, whether it's actually like a human being shrieking and screaming, or whether it's like an animal, or perhaps an inanimate object. Most of those words in English are kind of ambiguous in that respect. They can be interpreted in various ways. And since this text is also extremely ambiguous both on the lexical and on the syntactic level, because of the fact that basically you can interpret a number of words and structures in various ways, I felt this might be a nice opportunity for me to, in a sense, bring to the fore those different interpretations of my translation. So I focus on the word plane, which may be indeed interpreted in at least 3 different ways. Plane being like this kind of visual surface, but also plane being associated with aviation. And this was my strange association with Guernica, which was actually created 10 years after the creation of this poem, but I felt that it might be an interesting allusion. And then plane being like this woodworking tool that actually goes together with lumberman. So I actually created 3 different interpretations of this poem in Polish, playing with sounds, each of those interpretations, one focusing on the visual, one focusing on the woodworking carpentry, involving like more, I would say, mechanical sounds, and one focusing on the suffering of Guernica characters, which would involve more of kind of pain and suffering of animals and humans. So my choices of sounds were different for those particular 3 versions, and I can actually read out to you some short passages, and this is going to be the end of my presentation. So the first one, which was more focused on the visual qualities being reconstructed in this translation, is the one to the right next to the original. I'm just going to read out a few passages of that text. Picasso dajesz nam co wypukłe, wiek płuc wtłoczony ostry gęsty umysł. Robisz nam cięte prezenty zawsze zamknięte w pysznym pisku prostoty. Z czerni nieszczelnej coś tryska mętnie skrzyp płaszczyzn, albo z pomiędzy wycia niczego porwanego w krągłą wrzaskliwą ścisłość bryły krzyku szepcą. So a completely different sound quality is kind of used in the second one, which involves more of human and animal sounds. Picasso dajesz nam rzeczy wytrzeszczone, wieńczące płuca, wtłoczony ostry gęsty umysł. Robisz nam cięte prezenty zawsze zamknięte w wystawnym wyciu prostoty. Z odczapowanej czerni coś tryska mętnie pisk płatów lub z pomiędzy kwików niczego porwanego w krągłą wrzaskliwą ścisłość zbite krzyki szepcą. And the third sounds so different. Picasso dajesz nam rzeczy, które sterczą, stęk płuc, wtłoczony ostry gęsty umysł. Robisz nam cięte prezenty zawsze zamknięte w zasobnym zgrzycie prostoty. Z odczapowanej czerni czegoś tryskają mętnie skrzypiące strugi lub z pomiędzy pisków niczego w kolistym uścisku wrzaskliwej szczelności lite krzyki szepcą. It's quite a mouthful again in Polish, because Polish enjoys clusters of consonants, so the sound quality is completely different, and obviously Picasso sounds different in different translations. I actually encouraged my students to create some more versions, and right now I have something like 30 different versions of the same poem to compare in the future. And probably this is going to be it, because I won't manage to
speak of Eve Chungi. Thank you very much for your attention, and these are references.
Thank you.